we have a patriotic show for a patriotic day in honor of Memorial Day. I have two very special guests who have written, co-authored a very special book, very patriotic book. What's it like to serve survivors of a national tragedy and then find hope in the rubble and then write a best-selling book about your experiences there? It's quite a ride, I'm sure. The authors of Triumph Over Terror, Chaplain Bob Ossler and Janice Hall Heck, discuss this phenomenal book and give us a peek into their next book, which is not terrorist related. Hi, I'm Patricia Durgin, the Christian Message Coach, and this is Marketers on a Mission, the live show for every Christian with a message to market. Hey, Bob, how are you today? Hi, Jen.
I am wonderful.
So good to see you. You both look so wonderful. We're very excited. Both your books have exciting news that's just come out and been published. We're going to talk about it one piece at a time. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Yes, absolutely.
You both have such a variety of backgrounds, each in your own way. It's really interesting to me. Bob, you're a firefighter, an EMT, an Air Force veteran, Moody Bible Institute graduate. And then Janice, you have 3 master's degrees. You've lived and worked in Alaska, California, Hong Kong. It's hard. That just doesn't slip under the rug, does it?
No, it doesn't.
I imagine that's a big conversation starter.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad that both of you are here. You both have a varied background, and yet Christ has brought you both together several years ago to become a writing duo, a team, hasn't he?
Yeah, it's been a beautiful relationship.
A beautiful relationship.
I don't know. How do you feel, Jan?
Well, it's been working very well.
Yeah, don't tell us anything different.
We met and we clicked right away, and we've been working together for 3 years now. 3 years.
And you met at a writer's critique group. Am I remembering that correctly?
Right. My friend Catherine Ross and I started a writer's critique group in Bob, and Bob's pastor wanted him to attend. And so he attended and started telling his stories, and it's like, wow, you have to write that book. So that's kind of how we first connected.
It's interesting that one writer can recognize talent and great content in another person who's not even contemplating writing a book, can't they?
Right. It was very obvious from the beginning that this was a book that needed to be written.
Well, Bob, is it true? Tell me if this is accurate now. Is it true that you grew up feeling that you probably or might likely have a learning disability?
Yes, it is. I guess I wouldn't call it that back then. I kind of repressed that because what youngster or young adult wants to say, oh, I've got learning disabilities, and you want to fit in, you want to get along, you want to be recognized for good things, not negative things.
Yes.
And you don't want to be the dummy, the kid who can't get through the class or get the good grades. You want to fit in and get along. Mm-hmm. That's how it was for me. But, I'm meeting Jan at this group. There are multiple people there telling their stories. And I don't want to hedge in on your time here, but when I shared one story, Jan and Catherine were sitting at the edge of their seats with their jaws dropped. You could hit the floor with their jaw the way they were. And they said, do you have any more? And I told another story. And then they wanted another story. And I said, I've got hundreds of stories. They said, you got to write that. And I'm not a writer. Jan's the writer. I'm the one who brings out every one of those stories was in the top of my brain. I brought them out that way. And Jan made magic. That's the truth.
So even though we're going to talk about the new book that's not even yet titled, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Even you grew up thinking that you may have had a learning disability, even though it wasn't phrased that way in those days. I'm not sure that actual phrase even existed. And then Jan worked for decades serving people who had learning disabilities.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe as we talk, I don't know if it ever crossed her mind. I've never asked her this, but I don't know if it crossed her mind that she might have said, well, he might have some disabilities here. I mean, how would you tell an adult, a contemporary, as we say, gee, I think you have learning problems. No. I explained to her my situation. She said, okay, write me a story. I couldn't do it. I didn't do it. I said, I'm worried about spelling and grammar. And she says, you just do a brain dump. That's what we now call it, a brain dump. And I wrote stuff, and she sent me back an email saying, this is great. Send me more. Send me more. and I sent more, and I kept doing it. And the whole book was done that way. Story after story. And some of my stories kind of went over other stories, and she dissected it. And when I read that, it's like, wow, someone got into my head, brought this all out. Because I had attempted to write these years ago. Yeah. And I wept bitterly. It brought back a lot of anxiety, a lot of fears. I was having panic attacks. I was struggling with hurt and anger from being at the pile. Some of the things I witnessed. No matter what, I mean, you named a few things. I mean, I'm a licensed funeral director and embalmer too, and I have a degree in pathology. Actually, I have a doctorate in ministry. I mean, I look like goober, but I do have a doctorate. And people say, well, how does a guy with ADD get through all that? And we'll talk about that later. But all this stuff combined, trying to write the stories myself, too much anxiety, too much struggle, and I wept bitterly. And Jan says, look, you got to suck it up. You got to get through this and do it. And I did. And I explained it to her as I wrote that it was just very painful.
Yeah, it was quite remarkable because once he started writing these emails, he just flooded my inbox with them. And story after story, sometimes 5 or 6 or 7 emails a day. And often they were kind of mixed a bit, like he'd have one story mixed in with another story. And so I had a lot of cutting and pasting. And he was worried about the organization at first, but actually what happened was he wrote so much that I was able to, after a while, just put it into categories. And once I grouped the ideas, then the chapters fell into place pretty naturally. It's a sort of sequential book, so that made it a little bit easier. But that's kind of how we did it, just back and forth. And then we met every week on a Friday for about 2 or 3 hours, and then through. And Bob is very good with the gist of the story and telling the framework and all that, but I had to nag him for details.
And that's important. She needs to do that to be detailed. That way, because I can focus on I do a laser focus on what she says, and then she goes, that's what I want. This is wonderful.
Right.
Now, obviously, there's a lot of stories I didn't tell about Ground Zero because the general public could never handle that. And I really believe that. Now, I mean, firefighters and EMS and police probably could, but telling to just a very basic citizen or civilian, they would be quite repulsed, and it would be frightening to hear some of the things. So there's things we didn't put in there.
And every writer has to do that, don't we? Even though our writing is not as dramatic, our stories that we have to share are not as dramatic, potentially repulsive. I mean, we all have more to share than we have space to share it, don't we?
Correct.
Jan, had you coached someone on writing a book before?
I wouldn't say coach someone, but I've done a lot of editing. And actually, I worked for a journal after I retired from education. I worked for the Journal of Biblical Counseling and as a managing editor. So I edited a lot of articles. And one case in particular, I had to reduce an article from about, 30,000 words down to 10,000 words. And that's really where I learned good editing, because it was every single word counted, and I had to really look very carefully at every sentence and whatever. And I tried initially not to change the voice of the author, but after a while, you just have to do a little bit of that, because the wording, the word counts are so critical in publishing. Mm-hmm. But that's coaching an individual book. I've done pieces of books, and I do editing for friends, given my advice, which is, we get lots of advice, and sometimes it's the opposite, conflicting advice. So we kind of have to weigh everything out and see how it goes. So I enjoy working with writers, so that's fun for me. And that's how, of course, Bob and I got started. It was fun. to be doing this, although after a while it gets a little tedious, but it's good. We just keep going.
It's always tedious in the middle, isn't it? Whatever your project is.
Right.
Building a house, writing a book, it just gets that you get bogged down and you have to just push through.
Yeah. Right. We're kind of at that point with the new book. I've been saying to Bob, oh no, we have so much to do and we have to fill in this gap and we have to fill in that gap and so on. But last week I said to him, you know, I think we're over the big hurdle. We're over the hump, and now it really is filling in details and getting straightened out and whatever. So we'll still have to have another big outside edit, but it's really moving along.
How do you both maintain your vision, excuse me, to do that when you started a huge project with all kinds of words and ideas, concepts and stories, and then you put structure to it and the details, and then culled from that and ended up with a hardback book that is not, you know, it's not a Bible size, it's a regular length hardback book. How do you maintain your vision during the hard times?
We just keep plugging away at it and reminding ourselves what we're trying to accomplish. You know, what are we trying to do? And what is our message? What message do we want people to end up having?
Yes.
And that helped us refocus, going back to when we were stuck. Okay, what are we really trying to do? Okay, let's, you know, go to the next step and keep going. Just because we worked so well together, it didn't seem to be too much of a problem. We'd get bogged down a little bit, mostly because other things interfere. You know, we do live other lives, and we get busy with other things, and sometimes our book stuff falls to second place. But now we're kind of on a roll. We're really moving along, I think. Mm-hmm. Now we have to work in a different way because Bob's in Florida and I'm in New Jersey. So Bob continues his brain dumps, and then we're doing a lot of email and then a lot of telephone and that kind of thing. So it's interesting. We've tried lots of different methods. Some have well, and some have been total flops.
Yes, yes. And that's
in
all
the
part of
process
the process
we've learned.
Well, you know, to add to that, I mean, Jen nailed it right on the head. To add to that, we talked early years, and we both basically wanted to put out I don't want to say product, but a book, something that was going to be helpful to people. And we've gotten many, many emails and texts and private messages and comments on Facebook, etc., through blogs, etc., to where people say, this has helped me so much. If you look at the comments on Amazon, I've got at least 30 friends who say they just can't go to Amazon and do a comment because it makes them cry. They would just tell me personally, that book touched my heart beyond your understanding. The Holy Spirit gets in there, you know, and it's pretty neat to know that our book Triumphed Over Terror has touched so many lives. I've had many firemen, many EMS and police also tell me that. And we're hoping to have the same effect with our upcoming book too. But Jan hit it right on the head when she said we want to make sure that this helps people. And that's important.
And it did. I noticed that you had every single one of your Amazon reviews was 100% 5 stars. That's right. Amazing. That's amazing.
It is amazing. It seems unrealistic because people say, oh, no, you're never going to get 5. Well, I expect lower eventually, but you know what? It's because people are super critics, you know, and but these are people who have critiqued from their heart, who are affected, who are touched, who are moved. Like for me, writing this book was very therapeutical, and people reading it is even more therapeutical because they identify with how I identified with the tragic scene and the non-realistic destruction that I saw, and how I smelled it, how I tasted, how I felt it, how I heard it. All the visuals, the mind is a weird thing. We went back there, Jan and I, not to go off on a rabbit hole. We went back there together, and as I walked it with her and my wife, I kept flashing back to the destruction. It was the craziest, weirdest thing. It's like the file cabinet opened and I saw a slide of it. And I'd be walking and I'd say, that's where this was. This was, you know, and I could tell where I was at and where I stood. And one building would be completely destroyed and taken down, and so many things. And it was, I shook. I had anxiety there. And then going into the museum, seeing all the things that I touched now behind glass.
Oh, I'm not sure I would have been able to do that. How'd you handle it?
It was not easy. My wife watched me very carefully, and Jan was there for her if she needed her. But it was very difficult, and I also had a tough phone call that day, which I won't go into now. But it was a very tough day, but it was something I needed to do to complete this circle of therapy, as they say, or being therapeutic and going back, because I'd never gone back until after I was an author. And then being there with my co-author, and I think she connected dots too in what I was thinking, which was pretty interesting. Right, Jan?
Right. When he described scenes in the book, I flashed on, okay, there's where that is. Like especially the St. Paul's Chapel materials. Like, oh, here we are. We're in this graveyard that he talked about that was so filled with trash and paper and dust and dirt. And here's the church, and here's where the firefighters slept when they had total exhaustion. And, you know, it was very enlightening, and it made the book come more to life for me.
It must go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say it must have been surrealistic, almost like you were living two realities at the same time, Bob.
It was. It's almost like you've been shot into a time machine, because I hadn't been there in 15 years. And we actually took pictures of me in places that I stood when we took pictures when I was at Ground Zero. And it's almost ghostly. Sounds crazy. And I don't believe in ghosts, okay? But it was like, wow, here's a picture of me when I was at Ground Zero. Now I'm here now taking a picture of me with that picture at Ground Zero. And that was definitely an eye-opener for us.
While I'm thinking about it, let me check Facebook and see if we have any comments. Not yet. And also I want to show a screenshot of your latest. Tell me while I'm getting this out, tell me what's going on with the new book cover, please.
You want to go first, Jan?
Okay.
Let's see if I can pull this up, Jan.
Hey, I like.
Where did we go? Where are we? Here we are. Here we are. This is quite a different, I mean, the message is there. The colors are still there, so forth.
Right.
Why did you change this cover?
We had some interesting experiences with the previous cover. Ground Zero, Chaplain Bob Ossler was down below the title, and Triumph Over Terror, which was much more prominent, moved up. And we were in a bookstore today, and the bookstore owner said, hey, you know, people look at that book and they say, Trump, why are you writing a book about Trump? I won't read that. And to be honest, we heard that a number of times. Just people, you know, they're reading word configuration. They take a quick look at the title and it's Trump. It's like, and so it was giving the wrong impression right away. So we talked with our publisher, and she was willing to change. And so we decided, okay, we want the book to show right away what the book is about. So moving Ground Zero Chaplain right to the top explains right away what the book is about. And then you can also, in this version, see the building more clearly, the new World Trade Center. We think this will be a better cover for us. But covers, I mean, everybody knows the cover design is very critical, and sometimes you get it right the first time, and sometimes you don't quite get it right. Thankfully, we can make changes along the way. So this is our new cover, and we're quite happy with it. Now we can put a international book recognition sticker on it.
Yes. Tell us about that, please. That's such an enormous honor just to be a finalist. I mean, that's just less than 24 hours old news, isn't it?
Right. Actually, this is our second major award like that. Last year, 2017, we were in the finalist position in the national best books.
Oh, yes.
So then this year, it's a follow-on with the international book competition. So one award a year is not too bad.
One major award a year.
Major,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Well, and they say there were 2,000 or 3,000 entrants in the competition, although there are a number of categories that could go in. Last year, we submitted the book in the memoir category, and this year we submitted it in the history, U.S. history category. And so just a little bit broader exposure.
And I don't think that it's really perceived that way, but that's going to give it a longer life and be more valuable to more people through the decades to come, not just the window directly after 9/11.
Right. And in fact, when we were first showing the book to different people, we had comments like, well, this is old stuff. This is 15 years ago. Nobody's interested in reading this anymore. But we had a strong feeling that this is primary source material. And primary source material will always be valuable. Maybe not right this minute, but it will be valuable. So now, of course, getting this recognition in the U.S. history category, we think will really help a lot, and people will see it for what it is. It's a description of a critical period in U.S. history, and it's a very personal description of the time, a very heartfelt one. And so the other books we've read are more technical. They describe the events, the time that the planes hit the towers, the firefighters rushing in as people are rushing out. But this book has personal contact in it. And that's what we think is what touches people's hearts.
And lots of chapters, and the titles of the chapters are so compelling. I mean, they just grab my attention. I want to go read every single one of them at the same time. They're great chapter titles.
Yeah, it's funny because people will call me and say, you know what, I picked it up thinking, I'll read a little bit, and they couldn't put it down. They read it cover to cover. And other things in that book that I'm getting from other chaplains and instructors who teach chaplains and work with EMS and fire are saying that they're getting their classes that they teach to get this book because it's an excellent teaching tool. It's about a personal perspective at ground zero from a chaplain who went through everything all the other chaplains did, maybe a little more because not all the chaplains at ground zero had a degree in pathology and were used to identify remains. I mean, I don't know too many chaplains who do that, not to say that I stuck out, but I kind of did on that. But having that kind of intimacy and knowledge at ground zero and sharing that, and then we have a section there of things that you do say to people in a tragic situation, things you do not say to people in a tragic situation. And there's like a toolbox in there that really helps people. Anybody at pastors, associate pastors, youth pastors, yourself even, if someone comes to you and says, look, we had a horrible incident and can you help us? There's great scripture reference in there. There's things on how to just, my biggest problem in life is I'm a talker.
Yes, he has the gift of gab.
I appreciate that. That's my literary wife talking. Yes, it's true. I can tell a story and I can chat, and I love cold calling, going door to door with sales, and I can talk. But the hardest chapter to write in that book for me, thinking it wasn't even a gory chapter, but it was more about listen, listen, listen. And I got that idea from real estate. What do they say in real estate? Location, location, location. And listen for me was shut up unless they ask you a question, and just listen and just let them. You'd be amazed how long someone can talk without letting you interrupt them. And I learned a valuable lesson when I did that, and I get a lot of good remarks from people about that.
Hurting people are desperate to be listened to and their pain acknowledged and their confusion honored, and not be swept aside as if, well, it's been 30 minutes or 30 days or a year and you should just be getting on with life. They have every right to experience all those levels of grief, don't they?
Yeah, ironic that you would say that because I go to a veterans breakfast on occasion every Tuesday morning at the Southwest Military Museum and Library, who has our book now, and they also display it in their display case. I listen to veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, all the way up to current stuff. And these guys share horror stories with me. And I pray with them, I cry with them. And I mean, how many years ago was World War II? I've got guys still clinging to those stories of horror and buddies being killed in combat. And one guy shared a story where he went to go to the chow line, came back, they were all dead. You know, that kind of stuff. And this is the kind of stuff that you hate to hear it. But here's a man who's how many years later relieving that of himself, you know what I mean? Decompressing and getting it out and sharing that and saying, wow, I sure feel better sharing this with you. Thank you.
Yes.
Because you can't just tell that story to everybody.
That's right.
You know, and then some of the stories about war, there's just things I would never repeat, whether it's in private conversation. People say, well, tell me the worst story you ever heard as a paramedic that you did. And I say, you don't want to hear that. That would be something that you wouldn't be able to handle. Not that I can handle it. I still struggle with it. And I had a lady once push me to tell her the story. So 20 seconds later, she said, stop. I've heard enough. And we don't want to cause secondary trauma to people.
Yes.
You know, I can tell stories that are happy endings. Even then, what happened is kind of painful for people to hear, you know. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
You spent 45 days at Ground Zero. How could you stand it? I understand they weren't consecutive all the way through, but how did you stand it, Bob?
Well, a lot of prayer, a lot of devotions. My Bible was always in my turnout coat pocket. I'd sit down at the pile and read, study, and I reflect, and I'd meditate, and I'd pray. And I had other chaplains to talk to. And I was immediately, whenever I went out to the pile, I was immediately approached by people needing someone to listen to them. I mean, people would come to me and say, oh my goodness, I was there and this is what happened. I mean, the dad, the story of the silent man, the father who was running around Ground Zero looking for his son who was a fireman and his son who was also a police officer. And, you know, people who were, I hate to say crack-ups, but they were over the edge and we just had to settle them down and bring them comfort. You know, there's story after story where I was mocked. One time I was praying with officers and another officer mocked me. He just tortured me. And I prayed with the other officers and I prayed out loud because he stepped back. And I said, and the officer who stepped back, Lord, take care of him. And he came up to me later, thanked me for that prayer, and he apologized to me. I mean, I've got so many stories. It's a part of it. People, when you're in a situation like that, people do pray in foxholes.
Yes.
They do. And they need that prayer. And I wanted to be the one to give it to them.
They were there. Many people served. How did you go from serving and the chaos and the pain and the woundedness and seeing so much in horrible life situations to writing a book about it? Because everybody that served didn't write a book. So how did it come that Christ developed that in you?
Wow, that's a tough one. Because when I came home from Ground Zero and I knew it was my last trip, when I went there, Mayor Giuliani's office kept calling my home and saying, we need you back, we'll pay your flight, blah, 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 you know, which was very flattering because they needed help with morgue stuff and I was doing remains and all that kind of thing. And when I came home, I knew it was time to stay home because I knew my limits of what I could take and handle mentally, although some people may question that today, but I think it's more of I knew where I was at, I knew where I stood, came home, and I felt that vacancy of being this pastor at a tragic scene. And I thought, I even reflected in my book saying, in my Bible, saying, I think I know what it would be like when a pastor leaves a congregation. And I left Ground Zero, and I was very, very well known at Ground Zero. And, you know, I loved them and they loved me, you might say. St. Paul's really appreciated me there, and I appreciated them. And when I came home, I thought, I got to pastor somewhere. I need to be somewhere. And I went and found a pastorate. And that kind of sublimated for me, you know?
Yes, yes. Did you hold these things between the time that you came home from Ground Zero and you met Jan years later, over a decade later, and it was time? How did you know that it was time? How did you hold all that stuff without it wounding you further?
it did wound me further, holding it in. I would share stories on occasion, but like Jan would say, she finally took me and says, "You've got," her and Catherine Ross, these two chicks cornered me, you know what I mean? And they said, "You've got to write this. You cannot keep this to yourself." And I thought, well, okay, I've tried, but I've cried. And Jan says, "Look, you're going to cry. It's going to be hard. Get through this because this needs to be told." And I did. And the brain dumps, every time I started telling stories, oh my goodness, 10 other stories came to my mind. I mean, I know that I can sit here and literally tell you 30 stories, one after the other, and you'd be crying. And in doing that, we were very selective on what we put in there. In fact, I think there was some that were kept out. And the publisher, I love the publisher, but she wanted me to be very graphic and honest. We had to tone it down because I don't know that people could handle, the public is buffered from Ground Zero. Ground Zero said, "Oh, we recovered so many victims today." They didn't say parts. They said victims, and you don't want to get too descriptive, but they had to tone it down because the public was having their overfill of emotion too and anxiety. Jets flew over Ground Zero. People were horrified that those jets would have to engage the enemy over New York. And then it goes on with many other things. So that's kind of where it was at. And I did the brain dumps and I continued and was able to finish. And we came up with this wonderful piece of literature or art, if you want to call it.
Well, I have just a few more questions about this particular book, and then we'll move on to your latest project. But I want to ask, did you have a sense, whether it was formal or informal, that you were a steward of a story that needed to be told?
I think Jan brought that out of me. Jan and Catherine, you got to love Jan. Jan is so patient with me. Literally, we tease that she's like my literary wife because I'm going to be married 36 years tomorrow.
Oh.
And my wife is just a wonderful, loving, godly woman, and she sure tolerates a lot, and the fact that Jan I would throw mumbo-jumbo Scrabble words at her in complete paragraphs with no periods or commas, just run on, and she took that, and she understood me. And the more I did that, the more I would brain dump. She never once said, "Oh, where'd you get this nonsense?" She always was, "This is great. I can't believe how I was crying as I typed this. I couldn't stop crying." And I tell her more stories, and she says, "I couldn't stop laughing for that story." And it was all animation. And the more she did that, the more I was being rewarded for sharing. In other words, I didn't realize it back then, but as I look back now, I think she was being genuine and sincere. She could only tell you that, but it really did pull it out of me. And then we shared the manuscript with different people, and they wanted more. They wanted more. "Oh, we want more of this." And that's what we wanted. I was just writing the stories. Jan edited, corrected it, put it in a proper order, and that's why it turned out so well. If I didn't have Jan, this book would never have happened. Then Catherine,
we also had our critique group, a very faithful group of people, and we met once a month for 3 hours, and each time we would take in our latest version of whatever story we were working on, and the group would hack it apart and tell us what was good and tell us what we needed to fix, or this wasn't clear or whatever. So, and they encourage us to keep going too. So it's like you can't write a book by yourself. You have to do it as a team. So Bob and I as a team, but then we had backup support. And as we went to writers' conferences and showed parts of the books, we got a lot of feedback there too. How to frame it, how to do it, what we should expand, that kind of thing. And so we were encouraged along the way. Marlene Bagnall encouraged us.
Oh, my goodness, yes.
Lots of people.
Megan Breedlove, who nominated me and you for, the honors for something new and fresh, and, as far as the thing, right?
Yeah, so we're convinced that writers groups really are the way to go when you're really trying to write. And now I belong to probably 3 or 4 of them. 1 up here and 3 in Florida. Oh. I spend the winter in Florida, so I have found groups down there too to work with. So I have people looking at chapters now in Florida and people looking at chapters here in New Jersey, and we want it to be the best possible product. And sometimes the feedback we get, it helps us to sharpen what we're doing. Mm-hmm. Critique groups are the best.
You need to write a commercial about that, because that needs to be over and over and over and over everywhere.
Right. And the writers' conferences.
Yes.
Critique groups and writers' conferences for new writers or experienced writers. You know, you really can't do without them.
They are total game changers, aren't they? Both of them.
They are. And every person you talk to has a different insight and encouragement and whatever. You know, writers tend to get discouraged at times, but you go to a writers group and you get pumped up.
Yes.
You do.
On the way.
It's a wonderful thing.
It sounds to me that there are two individuals, one named Bob and one named Jan, who were just, the Holy Spirit just orchestrated the meeting. And
right, that's for sure.
All of the parts of your lives, education and non-education and life experiences and traveling, so that it was just the perfect, instead of the perfect storm, it was the perfect combination, wasn't it?
Right,
Yeah.
And I had just finished a writing project, so it was like, oh, okay, what am I going to do now? And then I meet Bob, so it was perfect.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. Jan and I got tossed into the frying pan, as they say, and last year I was nominated for my high school Hall of Fame, for Alumni Hall of Fame, and my English teacher from high school was there, and I took him aside, Mr. Page, just a wonderful man who I hated in high school because I hated English. And I was honest. I said that in my speech, and the place roared with laughter. But I took him aside and I said, "Come on, Mr. Page, how many students do you have that are authors now?" And he kind of chuckled. And he said he might have had one other one, but he didn't mention a name or anything. And I said, "In a million years, you be honest with me, you won't hurt my feelings. Did you ever picture me as an author?" He almost pottied. He laughed so hard. You know, he just thought that was hilarious. He says, "No, there's no way," because he knew, and I talked to him later about the ADD, which we'll get into, but he said, no way. And then he says because he's got the book and he loved the book. And, you know, he said, you have a good friend in Jan.
Because he saw you way back when, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, he knew me. He knew that I was a con man back in the day. You know.
The thing that I want to talk about with Triumph Over Terror is, we already alluded to it earlier about it being historical. And it's much more than just a story about what happened in Manhattan.
Right.
It's the challenges are let's say, the wounds may be different, but the depth of pain is everywhere in life, isn't it?
Right.
People with tragedies, people with devastation, people with sorrow and loss, and they don't know what to do with all of that, and they don't know where to go or who to turn to. So Triumph Over Terror can be used as a reference. You already mentioned it earlier as a textbook in chaplaincy schools and so forth. It's just filled with, this was absolutely horrible, and yet there was hope present.
Right.
Right.
That's a beautiful thing. That is a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Well, what I'm hoping people will get from this book, besides the fact that God was there, okay, is what you saw on TV. You saw some of that on TV back in the day. You can tell me where you were, just like the Kennedy thing and just like anything else, you know. That was major history. What you saw traumatized you. But you saw it on TV and it traumatized you. Imagine how the person who was standing at the tower saw that and it traumatized them. Imagine how it traumatized the firefighter who had to go running into the building. Imagine how the wives of the firefighters, or the husbands of the firefighters, or the police officers who had multiple things to deal with then and there. Everybody has their own traumatic experience to share. And this book touches every level of trauma or pain that you could experience. I saw it on TV and it was awful to see, but being there in the devastation, there's just nothing like it. And people have described it to me as like, I come over to you, Patricia, I grab your right hand, I hold your hand, I say, come walk with me. And when you read this book, you feel like you're walking with me hand in hand at ground zero, and I'm explaining the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, and you're negotiating. You don't just walk at ground zero. You have to negotiate girders and rebarb and glass and dangerous holes under the ground and things like that. That's what this book takes you.
Which sounds so somber and heavy, and yet real life is sometimes somber and heavy. And we need people who have walked that path who can help guide us back to the light, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Let me see if we have any comments or questions. I don't want to forget anybody. Molly Little and Patty, Llewellyn Nicholas have joined us. So good to see both of you ladies. Thanks for being here with us. So let's talk about, we've talked about the finalist award. We've covered that. Let's talk about your new project, which has equally deep impact, potentially, but in a totally different area, called ADD or ADHD, which are two separate diagnoses, and they have a lot of the same traumas, not as Manhattan, but amongst themselves. People who are often, there's lots of myths, lots of outright lies, medication. It's a huge undertaking. How are you addressing this newest project?
Go ahead, Jan.
Well, we've gone back and forth and trying to organize it in a sensible way that will make sense to people. But we want it to help people, so it can't be just stories. We do a lot of show and not tell in the book. Other books tell a lot about ADD, but we're trying to show what it actually looks like. So if you walk in a classroom, you see the kid over there and what he's doing. And but then we give advice. So from my special education background, in the early part, especially in the primary grades, Bob was having some difficulty. At the end of that section, I give some advice on, okay, if you're a teacher, you can do this. And if you're a parent, you can do this. But then later on, as Bob becomes more self-aware of what he's doing and what he's doing wrong, and how he goes around about fixing it for himself, we use more of his advice. Well, I really noticed I was different, but I noticed this other kid, and he was doing this and being successful. And so I thought, I can do that. Let me try that. So he was very aware of his differences and was looking for ways to change himself to be part of the group. But of course, ADHD is not that easily conquered. So it's like you conquer one facet, there's another one that bubbles up to the top. So, but each section of the book, we try to give insights into what's happening and what you can do if you're in this situation and how you could possibly change it. But the big message that we want to leave in the book is that ADD or ADHD, yeah, it is difficult. You have a difficult life with it, but you also have gifts. And part of what we want people to do is find the gifts in their ADHD or ADD. And one of Bob's gifts, I tease him about all the time, is the gift of gab. He can talk to anybody, anywhere, anytime about anything. And it's that engaging personality that actually helps him in his ministry.
Yes, yes.
We want people to look at their strengths. Other people will not have that gift of gab. They'll have a gift of art, or they'll have a different kind of gift. It doesn't matter what your gift is, as long as you know, okay, you have ADD, but you also have gifts, and let's look for those and let's build on them and look for ways you can use these gifts in your work and find the right kind of work for you. Just realize you can't do every job. You can't sit down and be an accountant and add up all the numbers and keep all the business factors straight. That would probably drive you crazy, but you could go out and be a firefighter, or you could go out and be other things. People with ADD tend to take more risks, and you can see it in Bob's line of work. They also tend to make a lot of changes in their life. They do one thing and then they look over the fence and say, oh, that looks like more fun. And then they go over and do that. And then they have another fence they look over. Oh, that looks like fun too. And that's kind of how Bob's story goes. But they're the turning points at the World Trade Center and a few others where he decided, this is exciting and all that, but I have a bigger purpose in life, and that's my ministry. And it's those turning points where he was looking deep inside himself to say, how can I make an impact on my world and other people's lives? And that's what we're hoping the second book will do, is to, you may have problems, but you can get through them.
Yes. I'm hearing a lot of introspection that's going on, a lot of observation that's going on. When you don't fit the typical mold, you can either stay stuck or you can find a new path. And Christ helped you find that, didn't he?
Absolutely. It's interesting because you had mentioned that it's not quite the same emotion writing this book, but I've had some very, very painful emotions. As I'm typing, I'll say, Jan, this really stinks, what I'm telling you. This hurts worse than I could tell you. And she said, you need to keep sharing this. You need to keep telling me this. You need to keep saying why it's painful, because someone's going to read this book and say, I heard about that too. I was in pain with that kind of situation. And believe it or not, I cried many times writing this book and sending her stories and anxiety and unfulfilled things that I felt I didn't complete in my life. Although I'm the guy who says, you know what, I'm going to try something. I'm going to try it anyway. And one of the whole things about this book is that you can teach me something today and I'll take notes, but I'll have to reteach myself that tonight. I have to take what Patricia says to me and I have to put it in language that I understand.
That makes sense.
I just took a real estate class. It was an accelerated class, 7 days, and we took the final, and now I'm going to take the state exam in the next week or so. But everything they taught me, I had to reteach myself. And I have memory techniques and ways to learn things to where I can look at a word and I can see the answer in the word. And it's hard to explain, but same thing happened in paramedic school. We used to have to memorize medications and then look at the name of the medication and tell the drug dose, the size for adults, pediatrics, and Valium, for example, was a 10 milligram, et cetera, et cetera. And I could look at the word Valium and I can see all the numbers and all the milligrams. I could see it all in the word Valium. And when I took the test, I felt like I was cheating because I knew how to look at the word Valium and see all the answers right in there. Yes. That was something that I designed that most people wouldn't grab. Jan gets it because Jan knows she's had education in that area, so she understands me a little better. So
you packaged all that information together, didn't you? So one word, but it came with all these other items.
Correct. And
he tells some fascinating stories about how he makes associations between things he has to learn and how he memorizes. So these tricky associations bring things back to his memory. And he even started doing that when he was in elementary school. It's kind of a lifelong trick that he's learned to help him memorize things.
There are a lot of people who feel that if you have ADD or ADHD, that somehow you are less than, you are or potentially learning a disability, or maybe you're on the borderline, or you're just plain stupid or lazy. They don't know how hard you have to work to maintain what everybody else takes for granted in regular life, do they?
Right. You got it.
And what we need, if we have ADD or if we have ADHD, is we're eager to learn. Eager to learn, very capable of learning, but we need to have the right environment, the right tools, and we need. We're not just going to fit in a box. We're just not going to.
It's funny you say that because I was at an awards ceremony the other night for the fire department, Cape Coral Fire Department in Florida, and I was sitting at a table. They put me with VIPs, all the politicians, and it was kind of funny because I didn't know any of them. Didn't know them, didn't care who they were. It wasn't that I don't care and didn't have any respect, but I didn't know who I was with, so that was good. My bliss was good. And then as I listened to conversations, the mayor's wife said, I don't know how to remember names. I said, no, that's funny because I used to teach people how to remember names. She goes, really? How would you remember my name? I said, that's easy because her name is Diane. And I said, you're with all respect, you're beautiful. You have beautiful jewelry on. You're very well elegant. I said, I think of Lady Di right away. Oh. And then her husband, so on and so on. I won't name all these names, but every one of them, she said, wow. And then at the end, I said, okay, who's who here? And she was able to snap them out to me because I taught her how to remember that stuff. And, Johnny here kind of looked like a mafia guy in Chicago, Johnny Checkers, and this other guy, and then Beth, and so on. And it was my being able to communicate technique that helps someone else. It's actually hard for some people to grasp, but some people get it right away. Jan and I have done book touring together. We were at her subdivision where she lives in New Jersey, and we went to the rec center, and we did a thing on the book. And I don't know, 35, 45 people were there. And what I did is I said, watch this. And I introduced every single person as they came in and memorized every name. And during my talk, I said, oh, and you, Joe, and you, Bill, and you, Martha, and you, Angela. And people were like stunned that we could do that. And then Jan would say, well, tell me how you did that. And I would try to show her. And I think she got it. So, right, Jan?
Right. And I do use that technique.
Mm-hmm. Well, you had mentioned to me also that you had had a really informative and productive conversation with Dr. Hallowell. Is it Hallowell? Hallowell.
Yes, Hallowell.
Tell us about him and what's going on with him and your work, if anything.
Well, we met with him in Orlando. Bob and I were working at my kitchen table one day, and I have Hallowell's book on the table, and I said, Bob, we need to get endorsements for the book. So here's a book, you need to get this guy to endorse our book. So Bob goes home because he's got such a gift of gab and nothing. He called up Dr. Edward Hallowell and left a message and described a little bit about his own ADD. And lo and behold, Hallowell called him back in a half an hour. And it was amazing to us, And so they're...
Tell us who Dr. Hallowell is.
Well, here, let's see.
He's a psychiatrist.
He's a prolific writer. And he's
world-renowned.
And he's a specialist
he writes books delivered from distraction, and he's got one that's coming out about its own biography of his crazy life, his crazy family, how he grew up in this crazy family. And he wrote the first book, popular book, about
the distraction.
And that's how Bob first connected with it. Bob heard him giving an interview on the radio, and Hallowell was ticking off, distractibility, hyperactivity, that poor attention, poor organization, all those kinds of things. And Bob said, hey, he's been watching me. So anyway, years later, Bob calls him and said, hey, your book changed my life. And that's how the dialogue started. Then as they were talking, Bob said, hey, are you going to be in Orlando anytime soon? And Hallowell said, I'm going to be there next week. So wow, can we meet? And so we ended up meeting Hallowell a week later and had this wonderful conversation with him. He's just a wonderful man and so brilliant. And he ADD himself.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
So he's not just an armchair specialist on ADD. Right. He's a survivor.
He's a world-renowned doctor.
Right. And he's a prolific writer, and he works with another guy named John Rady, who's also ADHD. Many books together, but he's written books by himself. But he's just a prolific writer. And we were thrilled that this big, well-known, first book has sold over 2 million copies. And his other books, this one doesn't say, but they're classic books. Mm-hmm. You look on Amazon today, you'll see they're way up there in the rankings. Still, I mean, the book is 20 years old. It's been revised and more than 20 years old. And it's still selling very well. So we were pleased that he would be willing to meet with us little newbie writers.
Another great opportunity because you've been serving with excellence. And Christ is opening doors, continues to, he's opened more than you could probably share, couldn't he? Hasn't he?
Right.
How delightful. Now, you haven't titled the book yet, but you're thinking it's going to come out. Tell us maybe in 2019. So give us some more information about that, and then let us know, where can we find you online, please?
We're keeping everything on Bob's website, www.bobosslerchaplain.com.
Okay.
And if you go to that website, then we have various pages and links to click on. And we're starting to put more information about the ADD book as it gets closer. So we're going to do some excerpts of the book, just little clips so you can see what the book is about. And we're also adding a few more excerpts from the Triumph Over Terror book. But it's bobosslerchaplain.com.
Okay, okay. And you hope to have you're just working with titles, and this is normal course of events when you're writing a book, isn't it?
We have about 30 titles, and some of them are ridiculous, and some of them are too academic, and we want to have a nice blend of a little bit of humor, a little bit of Bob Ossler type, and so we kick around things and we laugh, and it'll come. But we know we want to emphasize the strengths of ADHD people and the gifts that come along with ADHD. So that's very definitely, it's strategies for living and thriving with ADHD, but we have a main title and then a subtitle. It's going to have strategy.
What we want people to see, I mean, it's mostly boys than it is girls, but what we want people to see is that, like one of the stories in there, I was working in a police department as a chaplain, and I met the captain. He took me aside and we talked, and he's telling me, you told me you're writing this book. He says, when's it coming out? He wants to know right away, because all the educators out there are begging for this book already, because they want to see what a person who actually experienced it and did and how he's overcome. Because most people when I was a kid thought, if and this is no effect on janitors, if he's a janitor, he'll be a happy man, although custodians are very good people and educated sometimes. And they would always put me down. And the more I realized that with this book, that people with ADD, he said to me, his son is ADD. He says his son all he does is play with the computer thing all day with the thumbs, and I said, he says, he's telling me he wants to be a computer game inventor. And he says, I can't get him to stop. He's driving me nuts. I said, why would you stop him? Why? Do you know that the future is computers? I said, help him, encourage him, maybe go to school and learn more about it. And that'll get him to school to learn more about the craft that he wants to do. Yes. And he'd let me know later on, he says, that was a great idea, because now the kid is doing that and he's accelerating by learning more about that. He's getting better at it. And the boy may one day out-earn all of us with the knowledge and ability that he has as a computer game maker, that kind of thing. And there's story after story. And, people.
Yeah. And that was actually the story that Bob, that happened one day, and Bob called me and said, hey, guess what happened today? And talked about the police chief and son. So I said to him, Bob, that's your next book, because you've been through all of this and you know what you've done, and you have gifts, and other people do too, but they don't realize it yet. They're busy worrying about their problems that they don't look to the next step. Yes. That's really the day we decided to do this book. Our idea for another book that we were going to work on first, but then we put that away and moved right to this one.
It got edged out by this book.
Oh, Jan got fire in her belly for this book, let me tell you.
Well, because it combined his experience with my special education background. It just seemed like,
again,
the Reese's Buttercup, peanut butter and chocolate, it was just, it meshes well, and Jan is very patient with me. I need that. I need someone who's patient, because you know what, I know Jan's gotten frustrated with me. She'll never let on. Yeah, maybe she will after the book is done and say, you know what, I almost killed you 20 times. But no, she has been very patient, because there's times when we're talking and working, and I'll tell 40 different subjects in the same discussion. So, okay, Bob, get back, focus. No.
I have to say, Bob, stop, listen, we're talking about this.
When each
I mean, it's hilarious. I don't even realize I'm going off to talk about something else. In fact, for me to go through this whole interview process, I have had to hyper-focus so hard that and you know what, of all this, it's still driving me nuts, that wall behind you. I'm going to fix it.
Well, that's a great segue to say thank you so very much to two talented, uber talented people, committed Christians who are serving Christ and the giftedness that he has given them. Just dynamic duo. I'm privileged to know you just a little bit. Maybe we'll get to know each other in the future just a little bit more. Thank you so much for your time today, both of you.
Well, thank you. This has been fun, and we look forward to talking with you more.
Oh, thanks very much. Now, there's the real life book, not just the image of it, but the real life book. Let me close out, and I'll be right back with you, Jan and Bob. This has been Marketers on a Mission, episode 51, where I have interviewed Chaplain Bob Ossler and Janice Hall Heck. Both of them are authors of Triumph Over Terror, and they've got a fantastic second book coming up, specializing and focusing on ADD and ADHD, helping people find their giftedness within the framework of that diagnosis and live and be all that Christ wants them to be.
Amen.
Tomorrow is Tutorial Tuesday, so join me right here at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just like every weekday. Until then, I'm Patricia Durgin, the Christian Message Coach, and I pray this show helps you market your message for God's glory. Thanks for being here.